So here's the fun part. I get to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker has an impressive bio. You can read it on the website. In my opinion, he has accomplished a lot in a short time. And it's his theories that have influenced the systems thinking field widely, and in many ways have ushered in what is widely referred to as the fourth wave of systems thinking. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, also known as my very favorite systems thinker, Dr. Derek Cabrera.
Thank you. That's very sweet. And you're also my favorite systems thinker. Well, hello, everyone. And I want to echo the thanks to our amazing graduate students in the systems thinking, modeling and leadership program certificate at the Cornell Institute of Policy Affairs in the Brooks School. They have single-handedly pulled off a remarkable conference, and very excited to have them speaking and moderating and acting as panelists and all kinds of other things. So today I'd like to talk a bit about systems thinking as a field and take a bit of a retrospective view on where we've been over the last 20 or so years, and to frame where we are in the present and perhaps discuss where to go in the future. And in doing so, I hope to appeal to a very wide audience. We have, as Laura mentioned, we have lots of different people, from novices to experts, and crossing many domains, and really answer kind of four important questions about systems thinking. First, why do we need systems thinking? Who's it for? Importantly, what is systems thinking? One of the most important questions. And finally, how do we do it? But I didn't start off as a cognitive systems scientist. I started off as a mountain guide. And as a result, I spent over 200 days a year in a tent guiding clients up and down the mountains of the world for nearly 2 decades. And it was actually in the mountains, in nature, that I started to think deeply about systems and about thinking. And it wasn't until much later that I learned that there was a field that was called systems thinking. To a climber, the summit of a mountain is just an interdisciplinary problem to be solved. But to solve this problem, you have to understand the mountain and the expedition as a complex system of systems, as a kind of an integrated whole. And there are many different types of systems. There's the systems of physics and technical systems, like your gear, your rope rescue systems, and the external systems like the forces like the weather and snowpack and geology and geography. An old climbing mentor of mine used to say, mountains are just piles of rocks trying to get down. And that tells you a lot about the dangers and the situation in the mountains. There are also the systems of biology and chemistry, your physiology, your hydration, energy, metabolism, and especially the transfer of heat and moisture. The mismanagement of these things can lead you to kind of mundane problems like headaches and dehydration or not getting good sleep, to very severe things like hyper or hypothermia, frostbite, or even high altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema, the swelling of the lungs and head. And of course, there are the psychological and sociological systems as well. Climbing is ultimately not only a physical game, but a mental game, but it's also a social game. And a lot of people don't know this, but the reason why most expeditions fail isn't because of some technical challenge, but actually because people on the expedition conflict and can't get along. So this system of systems that I describe is not unlike the types of things that all of us deal with every day, all these different levels of systems that we have to integrate into all the things we're trying to get done in the world. But if I were to boil it down, all that I learned about systems thinking from these years in the mountains and through nature, I'd boil it down into this one life lesson, and that is that we have to learn to love reality. I mean, really fall in love with reality. Seek the truth, even when it hurts or makes you mad or sad or confused, or when it makes you feel things that you don't want to feel. And that means paying attention to all the signs around you. It means paying particular attention to the bias inside you, to be aware of what you desperately want to be true. I can assure you that no one wants to be lost and alone on the side of a mountain. Everything in you wants to at least pretend that everything's okay. But remaining calm and embracing the truth of the situation is the best remedy. In fact, our mountaineers have a saying, which is that the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. When what you think is in alignment with the way things actually are, the decisions you make will work the way you think they should. And the reason I boil it down to this one lesson is that we now know that we can teach people how to analyze and understand systems. In fact, you can learn DSRP, which we'll talk about a lot today, in less than 10 minutes. But it's far more difficult to teach someone to want to understand the system, to understand reality, to love reality so much that you actually want to hear from it and not be in denial to it. That's really the crux and the hardest part. The rest is just daily practice in the rules of systems thinking. And the reality is that one of the amazing things that nature will reveal to you if you're listening is the degree that it exists as what we call complex adaptive systems, or CASs. And the reason we want to know about CASs is because the systems that you care about, your work, not just the systems of science and things like that, but your work, your family, your life, your society, all these different things, your customers, your products, markets, those are all CASs as well. And in fact, systems thinking itself is a CAS. And it's a relatively new understanding of how complex systems work that's quite different than we'd previously thought over the last 2,500 years, like since Aristotle and Socrates. And this new understanding of the world was developed initially at the turn of the century, but reinvigorated in modern science in the 80s at the Santa Fe Institute, where I did a lot of doctoral and postdoctoral work. Now, to understand CASs, let me give you a very simple example that kind of differentiates between something that's merely complicated and something that's complex. If I kick a ball 3 times in exactly the same way, it'll do the same thing every time. And we could maybe do some differential equations or whatever, and it's quite complicated what it's doing, but it's basically following the laws of physics and things like that. Now, if I kick a dog, which obviously nobody should be kicking dogs, but if I kick the dog 3 times the same way, I might not get the same response. The first time the dog might, cower. The second time they might kind of stand their ground and growl. And the third time they might lunge forward and bite. And that's an adaptive system. That's a system that's changing its response, even though the stimulus is staying the same. So I want to show you a really cool complex adaptive system, or CAS. This is about 100,000 different starling birds. And as I'm saying this, they're all kind of flying to the left. And just in the time that it takes me to finish the sentence, they're all kind of heading back over to the right. And you think to yourself, how did 100,000 separate individual birds or fish orchestrate this movement that almost looks like they're a single superorganism? And that's what we call them, superorganisms. That almost has its own mind. How is that happening? And like I said, for 2,500 years, we've sort of assumed lots of things, but generally we thought, well, there must be some A-type personality leader bird that's telling all the other birds what to do. Well, it turns out there is no leader bird. There's not even enough time for the signal to get through the system. And so, big question mark, what's going on here? And it turns out that these systems are self-organizing, meaning there is no leadership per se, or you could say that the leadership is in what we call simple rules. And we can model these systems and we can see what these simple rules are. In this particular case, we can model them and see that they're really based on 3 different rules. One being that all the agents, what we call agents, are all kind of trying to point in the same direction based on their local neighbors. So they're just paying attention to like their fish friends and the ones that are right around them, and they're kind of aligning with each other. And they're also maintaining a distance. So they're not crashing into each other, and they're not spreading really far apart. So they're staying together and they're pointing in the same direction. And you can see them all kind of micro adjusting, each fish micro adjusting to their local neighbors. And that's what gives you this kind of amazing superorganismic movement pattern. And then the third rule is simply that they avoid predators or objects and things like that. So here's a guy trying to predate on one of the fish, and you see them kind of go away, and then they follow rule 1 and 2 and rule 3, and different fish or birds are following different rules at different times. And all those rules, thousands, millions of interactions between agents, are leading to what we call the emergent behavior or the emergent properties of the system. So if we sort of take this idea and reduce it to what's the formula or something that's going on, the basic formula is that you have this system level behavior that's incredibly complex, sometimes very surprising, but really what's happening is that you have agents of some kind and simple rules, and the agents are following these interaction rules with other agents, and they multiply to create the system level behavior. So another way of saying this is that the micro multiplied makes the macro, and that there's actually simplicity underneath the complexity. Now, this is interesting just because we are curious about these kinds of systems, but if you're in a space where you're trying to actually affect these systems, this is incredibly important because it tells you where you can intervene in these systems. If you want to change the behavior of complex systems that maybe you're even a part of, you can intervene kind of below the line with the agents. You can change the agents, you can change the mental models of the agents, the simple rules that are governing them. But if you try to change it above the line, it's like kind of throwing a rock or a huge boulder into the ocean. It's really not going to have a huge effect. Now, after retirement from mountaineering, which is a little bit like professional sports in that when you're 30, you're kind of old for a mountaineer. And I did a stint as a rafting guide for several years just to chill out a little bit. And I noticed something about the different guides and how they related to the river, to reality. The newer guides, they were strong and full of confidence, and they used their considerable muscle to, muscle the boat in order to get the boat to do what they wanted it to do. They worked hard, they were strong, but they were working kind of against the system. It was like them versus the river, right? But if you paid attention to kind of the old salty dog guides who understood the river as a system, and they understood that the river is much bigger and much more powerful than any or all of their muscles. So they knew to finesse it. They waited for the right moment, and they would dip a single oar in a single place and make one pull and move the boat just slightly to get the dynamics of the water to hit the back of the boat and turn it the way they wanted and move the boat to the position in the river where they wanted to be. In other words, they worked smarter. They worked with the system. In fact, they didn't just work with the system, they worked in the system. They were part of the system. And so when, if I were to summarize all this, I would just say when you see kind of complexity or you're overwhelmed by complexity around you, look for the simple rules that lie underneath and the agents that underlie that complexity. And of course, we live in a VUCA world. General Casey's going to talk about VUCA during the conference. But we live in a VUCA world. That's just the way it is. The problem isn't that the world is VUCA. That's reality, the reality that we have to learn to love. The problem is that while the real world is VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, the way we tend to think about the world is a term that I coined called LAMO. And LAMO just means linear, anthropocentric, which is just kind of human-centered, mechanistic, and ordered. Now, what it basically means is that we have a bias, and that we're biased in ways that don't really match up with the way that the real world actually is. When we project this bias onto the world, and as a result, often miss the critical feedback that the world is giving us constantly. So let me go into this a little bit. The real world is dynamic, it's adaptive, it's organic, and constantly evolving, yet we tend to think very mechanistically. We even have metaphors that we use, like the universe is like a clockwork, or the brain is like a computer, neither of which is really a terribly good metaphor, because they're both not in alignment with the way things really are. The real world is multivalent by nature, meaning and both can be true. Yet our thinking tends to be needlessly bivalent, either or kind of thinking. So you can ask yourself, what do your customers want? Do they want your product to be faster or cheaper? Well, probably the answer is both, and both, not either or. The real world is networked and nested and complex with a sprinkling of randomness, yet we tend to think of things in very ordered and static categories and hierarchies and pyramids. The real world is nonlinear and includes feedback and webs of causality, yet we tend to think in very linear, single causal ways. And of course, the real world is agnostic about human endeavors. We're incredibly small and, believe it or not, pretty insignificant, yet we tend to look at things through a human-centered or anthropocentric lens. And we're actually designed to sort of see the world through our own anthropocentric lens, that our world sort of centers around us. And of course, this isn't the case. So systems thinking requires us to unlearn some of these learned mindsets and to practice 4 simple rules that we call DSRP. And DSRP just means distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. And each one of those rules has 2 components to it. As you get more deeply into the ideas and the theory, you start entertaining what we call the elements, which is distinctions, identity, other, part, whole of systems, action, reaction of relationships, and point and view of perspectives. And like I said, you can learn these 12 words, these 4 rules in 10 minutes. The harder thing to grasp is that they're simple rules that operate dynamically together. They don't act as a stepwise list, like first D, then S, then R, then P. And that's the part that takes a little bit more time to understand, but you could literally memorize and understand the basics in a few minutes. But to understand that DSRP are the simple rules that are underlying cognitive complexity and that we use to understand material complexity, that's where you just need some practice, because they're like the simple rules that are governing, the bird flocks that we just talked about. And this all manifests as mental models, the way we organize information to make meaning. So the first step is to acknowledge, the first step in becoming and practicing systems thinking is simply to acknowledge that mental models exist and become aware of the role that they play in our lives. And they play a very, very significant role. In fact, mental models are pervasive and ubiquitous in our lives. In other words, they're constant. But most people don't even recognize their mental models exist. They suffer from what we call reality bias. Reality bias is the granddaddy or root of all biases. It's the belief that we see the world directly as it is, with no awareness of the veil that we're shrouded in, which is our mental models. The truth is, we see the world indirectly, mediated through our mental models. And if I were to summarize what we've learned from the combined fields of cognitive science over the past 50 or so years, it's this. We thought we were biased. We originally kind of knew that humans are biased, but we are even more biased than we thought. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean by mental models and how they can be out of touch with the real world. This is how we typically think of an organization, a classic org chart representing how an organization is structured. But This is really much more accurate in terms of how an organization is actually structured. There's a lot of both informal and formal systems. It may have hierarchical top-down formal structure, but it also operates as an informal and dynamic network of influencers and influences. And here's a great video that kind of captures how pervasive mental models are. So these guys are arguing about what that thing is. He's testing. He's a good scientist on the right, testing things out. Testing again. That guy's just convinced. Third test. Fourth test. Oh. Yikes. Brutal. So that's kind of brutal, but what he should have done, he was a pretty good scientist up until the end. He should have had the other guy test it. So once we take the big step of acknowledging mental models, we need to take the next step of testing them in the real world, kind of like that one wildebeest was doing. And to recognize that our mental model is only an approximation of the real world, not the real world itself. And that you have to test your mental model in the real world. Don't build it in isolation in your head. Expose your ideas to the light of day and test them out. And then it's a cycle. So we incorporate feedback that we get from the real world in the form of information that we get from the real world. And paying attention to feedback helps reduce cognitive biases. In other words, we adjust our mental model to real world systems. But remember, I said that the direction you go in really matters, the direction of the cycle. That's because of another bias that we call confirmation bias, right? And this is one of the most pervasive biases we face. This cartoon, which is one of my favorites, perfectly kind of illustrates confirmation bias. The two pilots say, what's that mountain goat doing up here in the cloud bank? Right? So these pilots are not in love with reality. They're not taking the feedback that nature is giving them. And, not a good situation other than the fact that it's a cartoon. So what's critical, the way to avoid confirmation bias is to follow the systems thinking loop in the right direction. Note that while systems thinking fits the mental model to the real world based on feedback, evidence, and facts on the ground, confirmation bias is the mirror opposite, right? It fits the real world to our mental model, something a fair amount of us do pretty regularly. System thinking requires us to fit our mental model to the world, to love reality and understand the system and avoid our biases. When you fit reality to your mental models, problems present themselves. You might get a feeling of control, but it will be very, very short-lived. But when you fit your mental model to reality, it avoids biases. Solutions will present themselves because you'll have a deeper understanding of the system. And you'll see ways to work with and not against the system. And the predictions and decisions you make will work out the way you expect them to. And so, again, this is a loop. So it means you go around over and over again, kind of like that one wildebeest was doing, and take advantage of incremental improvement over time. We remind ourselves that we get better in inches, not in miles. But incremental improvement is slow. And even when we do it in fast cycles, so we want to increase the probability of seeing real world systems in the way that they are. To do this, we need to understand how both real world systems and mental models can share or differ in their DSRP structure. So let's focus on the mental model side of the loop for one moment. We see that when we get feedback from the real world in the form of information, this information has to get organized in some way to make meaning, to make a mental model. And so mental models are not just made up of information, they're made up of information and organization. So when we look at mental models, we see they're comprised of these two parts: the information content, which is like data and other things that we get from the real world as feedback, and the organizing of that data or that information, which is sometimes called by many names: structuring, cognition, encoding, or just in regular words, thinking. And when we look at how we organize things, there are these four patterns that underlie how we structure or organize information. We make distinctions, we organize systems into part-whole groupings, we recognize how things affect each other, relationships, and all of that's being done from some perspective or frame of reference. And now if we take a look at the other side, we can ask ourselves the same thing: how are things organized? And we see nature is also comprised of information contained in particles and stuff. And you can think of physical energy and matter as structure that organizes information. And we see that nature has a set of organizing laws around how it organizes. And if this unified or parallel structure in the way things are organized makes it possible to kind of increase the probability of a match. And remember that the problems we encounter result from the mismatch between how real world systems work and how we think they work. And in fact, we see a parallel structure in the unity of the name systems thinking itself. The name itself characterizes the bringing together of real world systems, reality, and our mental models of those systems. That's why it's called systems thinking. Now, our research lab studies how to increase this match between what you think, what is called mental models, and what is real. And when what you think matches what is real, the decisions you make work out as planned. That's critical. That's good feedback. If they're not working out as planned, that means that there's a mismatch. If we use sort of slightly more technical speak, we can say we need to increase the fit between cognitive complexity, the reality and complexity of what happens in your mind to cause you to think what you think, and material complexity, the reality and complexity of what happens in real world systems, such as, of how they behave and do what they do. And again, systems is just a generic word, but remember that systems of all kinds, not only in science, but also systems like the ones that you care about most, like your family, your kids, society, your country, whatever. Those are all things that are systems too, policies, et cetera. As Daniel Kahneman pointed out, we have two really powerful thinking modes. And the first is called System 1, and it's the one we use 95% of the time. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's emotional, it's automatic, and it only has one tiny little downside, which is that it's prone to error. So it's kind of a huge downside. The second is System 2 thinking, which is serial or loop thinking. It's metacognitive, it's aware, it's sort of systematic, it's evidence or information feedback based, and it's slower, but it's more accurate. So its downside is that it's slow. Our research indicates that with practice, metacognitive awareness of systems thinking, DSRP rules, increases speed, accuracy, and complexity of thinking, or it increases cognitive complexity. This gives you a third option that's both fast and accurate. And this is not unlike, if you want to understand what I'm saying here, this is not unlike when top athletes or soldiers perform under pressurized and chaotic environments based on the muscle memory that they developed in practice. So we're saying sort of the same thing as that, except what are you practicing? You're practicing burning the neurons and the pathways for more complex cognitive complexity. And so basically that comes down to reps, repetition, and streaks, which just means repeated reps, of understanding these complexity producing structures, what we call reps and streaks, right? And one of the best ways to get started, and we're happy to share the research on this, is to focus on these 5 questions just to get out of the gates and get started. What things am I choosing to see and not see? Identity other. S, how are things grouped or not grouped, right? Relationships, how are these things related or not related? It turns out the not's really important. Starting to combine the items together. We call that an RDS, relationship distinction system. Do these relationships have parts, and are those parts related? And so on and so on. And you start to see how complex it can get. And of course, from what or whose perspective is all that being done? Now, for more than 25 years ago, I would say, DSRP theory led to my doctoral work in the field. And since then, DSRP theory has been somewhat disruptive and launched what Laura talked about, the 4th wave. But I want to share with you kind of a retrospective view of where the field was in the past. And I pretty vividly remember kind of coming out of mountaineering and coming to the field for the first time formally as an academic. And I was like that little duck in that book, Are You My Mother, right? Who goes around trying to find the mother in the farmyard. And except what I did is I went around the world visiting some of the best in systems thinking and systems scientists and asked them sort of a single question, which was, what is systems thinking? And I got a lot of different answers, most of which were just woefully dissatisfying to me. But they trended towards grouping into several different themes. So I'll share those themes with you. First was that systems thinking was a stepwise process, right? And I knew this couldn't be right because nothing is more complex and nothing more adaptive than human thought. And certainly human systemic thought is the most complex of the complex thought. So by the law of requisite variety alone, a stepwise process would not have enough robustness and variety to govern the full scope of systemic thinking. The second type of answer I got was that many answered that systems thinking was a particular method, right? And notably in the United States, the field was dominated by a strand of systems thinking called system dynamics, or SD, very powerful method that was invented by Forrester and then popularized by Peter Senge. And so I studied this method and I found it very powerful, but I also found that it really only applied to certain types of problems and types of systems, not globally to all systems. And otherwise became kind of a scenario where when you're an SD hammer, everything kind of becomes an SD nail. The third kind of answer that I got was that systems thinking was accidentally conflated with the system sciences. And although I had trained pretty widely in the system sciences and still today consider them my academic home, there was this pesky little word thinking in the name. And believe it or not, I had to convince a fair amount of people in the field that systems thinking was indeed a cognitive science. And indeed today, it's much more widely accepted that systems thinking is itself an act of gaining metacognitive awareness. And perhaps the most popular stance was held internationally, not as much in the US, but internationally. And that was that in order to master systems thinking, you had to master this plurality of methods. And that could take decades or more for you to do that. And I'd soon realized that this plurality was really a mishmash of frameworks developed by people based on a lot on their opinions and unsupported by empirical work a lot of the times. But even then, I diligently studied them all and put them to use. And I believed them that this was the answer, even though I was a little suspicious. But what bothered me most about all of these answers was that none of them was grounded in sort of scientific empirical evidence. It seemed that the field was mostly dominated by opinion or philosophy or popularity. And to say that was to be called, pejoratively a reductionist or something like that. So let me share with you what systems thinking is today. Systems thinking is a complex adaptive system based on a set of simple rules. It's not stepwise process. And it's not a specific framework, nor is it a plurality of frameworks, although those individual frameworks have tremendous value as tools for certain types of tasks. Systems thinking is metacognitive awareness of the ways information can be organized. And importantly, systems thinking is not just for technical applications and experts, although it does have that use. I want to take a minute to discuss this last one in particular, because it's been a kind of a pet peeve of mine. Systems thinking cannot and should not be solely an elite technical enterprise for experts. It is a tool for advanced application, but it's also a tool for everyday application. It should be taught to children, and it can be taught to children. And it must be accessible and useful to the masses to solve relatively routine, although complex, everyday problems. And it must also be hyper-technical in order to solve the most sophisticated and difficult problems. In fact, Einstein had this wonderful quote that he said, "The whole of science is nothing more than a refinement of everyday thinking." Thinking is something we do every day. It underlies everything. It's the root of both everyday and wicked problems. We need more thinking and scientific and systems thinking in our everyday lives. And science really, in the aggregate, is just systems thinking. So systems thinking is both simple and sublime. It's pedestrian and profound. And never before has there been a more clear time that explains just why this is. Take the recent news on COVID. We're expecting a big wave this fall. And because we're all tired and because of politics and lots of other things, the government is likely not going to mandate much at all. And it might make a few suggestions. But here's the thing: the spread, hospitalizations, and deaths that result will be entirely up to us. They'll be entirely based on our individual mental models and our ability to form systemic mental models and understand how our individual behavior multiplied by many interactions leads to emergent outcomes. So it makes no difference if some expert epidemiologist can run a model and predict what's going to happen. That's nice, and it's important. But what matters is that 300 million people in the US, or 7 billion people in the world, understand systems and can think in systems. What 7.5 billion people in the world do is what matters. And they will do what their mental models tell them to do. It must be used by the most advanced among us and also accessible to 7.5 billion of us. And we have to strive for that. Yeah. So many years ago, when I first met Laura, I want to tell you a little story to wrap this up. We were both hired to run a large grant for NSF, and her role was to translate my theories into practice. My job was to teach her my theory. I'll never forget that we were sitting in an airport on our way to a conference, and we had just met, and she said to me, "Explain your theory to me." And I did on the back of a flight itinerary. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know exactly what we need to do." And I was happily shocked because I definitely did not know what we needed to do. So I asked, what do we need to do? And without missing a beat, she said, "We've got to go teach this to kindergartners." And that was that. We spent the next 10 years in K-12 schools teaching these same ideas to kids in every grade, just in a different content. And that was when we knew that systems thinking can and should be taught and can and should be learned with great effect. The same ideas I was teaching doctoral students at Cornell, we were teaching to kindergartners. And these same concepts we teach worldwide to some of the most sophisticated problem solvers and innovators, CEOs, and leaders today. The same ones, there's no difference. The content is a little different, but the concepts are the same. And many years later, Laura had actually kept that little piece of paper and gave it to me as a present, framed. And if you want to thank someone for making systems thinking accessible and everyday useful, one of the absolute hardest things to do, you should thank Laura. So let's wrap up by revisiting the 4 questions that I talked about at the beginning. Systems thinking, why do we need it? We need it for both everyday and existential surviving and thriving. Every one of us needs it every day to survive and thrive in a VUCA environment, but we also need it existentially to meet the various crises we face. Who's it for? Systems thinking is for any person, for any system, for any novice, for experts, and it's for everyday and advanced applications. And what is it? It's a cast. Systems thinking itself is an emergent property. You can't do systems thinking. You can do the simple rules, and systems thinking is the emergent property of those simple rules. And how do you do it? Well, I just said how you do it. You mix and match these rules to ask new questions and create new knowledge about reality. We'll have a talk later on structural predictions and lots of others that'll get into that a little bit more. And that's pretty much what I got for you today.
Well, thank you for that engaging and interesting talk, and for that lovely story at the end, which I was not expecting, but was happy to hear and appreciate it. So we do have some questions from the audience that I was thinking I would throw out to you so that you can address them directly. And then we'll sort of take it from there. Sound good?
Sure.
Good. All right. So the first question was related to the idea that you said DSRP could be learned in minutes, and the person wanted to know, you said it's harder to understand DSRP as simple rules, even though they're really easy to teach. And I think there was a little bit of clarity on that.
Yeah, so, you know, a person can understand distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives in the amount of times it takes you to sort of say that, or, you know, maybe 10 minutes, you can learn those 4 things. You can learn that each one is made up of 2 elements that are interacting, like distinctions is identity other. There's a boundary between what the thing is and what it's not. Systems is part whole, so every whole has parts, and every part can be a whole, and every whole can be a part of a larger whole, so that there's some remarkable complexity there. Relationships are made up of an action and a reaction, so something is acting and something is reacting, and vice versa. And perspectives are actually made up of a point and a view, and so you can change the point or change the view, and together they make up a perspective. You can learn that in, you know, a few minutes or a few hours, whatever. It's not very difficult to learn those ideas. What we find is harder for people is what people will typically do is they'll see DSRP and they'll say, oh, well, first you do D, and then you do S, then you do R, then you do P, because it's stepwise, right? We're very used to stepwise processes and instructions. And where people have difficulty is understanding CASs, understanding that these are simple rules that are multiplying against each other, combining and recombining with each other to create new forms, new structural forms that can be filled with information. So you can ask questions that are just structural questions that can take you to very advanced applications or very simple applications using DSRP structure. So hopefully I answered that. I mean, the harder part is to get people to understand the dynamics. Understanding the 4 things is easy. Yeah.
Yeah. So just as a clarification from the audience, so when you say that systems thinking is a cast, do you mean that if you do D and S and R and P over and over, then that's how you become a systems thinker?
Yeah, that's how systems thinking emerges. So one of the things I talk about a lot is that, you know, people say, oh, well, how do I do systems thinking? Well, you don't. Systems thinking is really an emergent property of doing these simple rules, because systems thinking is wildly complex and it's, you know, applied to various things. So the thinking that's coming out of it is going to be different in every scenario, every situation. So when we study these things, we have to ask ourselves, well, if systems thinking is different in all these scenarios and wildly complex and diverse, well, what's going on underneath that we can actually help people to do so that they can do that systems thinking about the system that they care about the thing that they care about, because what they care about might not be what, you know, the person next to them cares about. And, but they're all systems. And so how do we approach those things? Well, we use these simple rules.
Excellent. The other question from the audience was looking for a little bit of clarification on the difference between systems thinking and systems science.
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, system science should really be called the system sciences, because there's a ton of them, and they're doing so many cool things in the world. I mean, it's hard to imagine a science today being applied in any truly remarkable way that isn't starting to become systemic in nature, or interdisciplinary, or multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary, whatever term you want to use. But so there are many system sciences and lots of world-renowned, brilliant people working in different system sciences. The thing that I sort of think about is, well, if we were to take all those remarkable people working in those remarkable sciences, and we were to kind of cut across and look for the pattern that connects, what is the way that they think that connects? That is systems thinking. Systems thinking is kind of how we approach these different fields.
I see.
I had a do we have time for a story, or no?
Of course, always for you, a story.
I had a really wonderful mentor, advisor at Cornell. His name was Will Provine. He's since passed, but he was an evolutionary biologist, and he did a course that I was a TA for. And during this 1 hour period, he would go through just like a death march through like all these really complex evolutionary concepts. And the students, you could tell they were just like overwhelmed, scribbling notes, trying to capture, taking photos, all this stuff. And about the last 3 minutes of the course, he said, I learned all of this at one of the best programs in evolutionary biology at University of Chicago when I was a doctoral student. And then in the last few minutes, he puts up a slide where on the left side is all the things he just covered in the last hour. And he says, and I want to show you all the things that are now today thought not to be the case. And every one of them was checked. And then in the last 30 seconds of the class is just this really visceral experiential class that was so powerful. He said, so what is it? If this is what I learned during my doctoral studies at the University of Chicago in evolutionary biology, and all of these things are not true today, what did I learn? And everybody's like, I don't know, what did I learn? What did you learn? And he said, I learned how to think like an evolutionary biologist. So that's the difference, right? Yeah. That's the difference between the thinking that is so critically important, because teaching people what exists is different than teaching them how to think so that they can create things that don't yet exist.
It's a great story. We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions, choosing them sort of at random as they're coming in, but I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll move into the next speaker. This question is, are our social, economic, and environmental systems anti-systems thinking, meaning hierarchical, closed, and rigid? And do you think the Industrial Revolution has set us up in a space where systems thinking is a big leap? And maybe you can speak into how you were talking about current times are changing the way that we need to think.
That's a really astute question. And it's actually kind of an interesting question, because you could say, yes, we've set these systems up to be structurally, not systemy. But the truth is that these systems are systemy. And the way they operate is not how we describe them. That's what I was getting at in that. When we look at our organization, we say, oh, we set it up as a hierarchy, and here's the org chart. And so that's the way our system works. Well, that isn't very systemy, right? But the truth is that's not how your organization works, because your organization is kind of a living, breathing thing. And there's people and all kinds of things involved in it, and they're adaptive. And so they're doing all these things that alter the dynamics of the system. And so that system isn't the way we're describing it. That system is a complex system, but we're kind of missing its complexity, and we're treating it like that young river guide, that's gonna muscle through it and force it to do things. And that system is so much bigger than us, and we should work within it. That's why we got to love reality. If you don't love reality, you're not going to have the curiosity to say, boy, this is what I think, but what is this? What's really going on in this system? How does this system, I'm going to listen to the system, and I'm going to let the system tell me about itself.
Great. And just a few kind of housekeeping kind of things that are coming up in the Q&A. Derek, while you're here, somebody said you mentioned structural predictions. They're wondering if there's going to be more on that. There will be a panel on that. The Mathematics of Innovation will be talking about structural predictions.
We will. That'll be fun.
Yeah, other people are really curious to hear more about education and kindergartners and how we teach these things to kids. That will be covered very nicely in the education panel, which is tomorrow at the end of the day. So don't miss that. And others are wondering if we're going to be having copies of slides and things. And what I will say is each speaker will share selected slides or their entire show and or their papers on the conference website after the conference is finished. So we will obviously, because we know who you all are, send you a notice when all of that is up and ready for you to view at your pleasure. All right, so I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge and thank Dr. Derek Cabrera for his talk and for his answers to the questions. And my little, here, I'll be your only applause that you can see in here.
Thank you.